Who is F. Nelson Blount? And what led to the formation of what would eventually become Steamtown National Historic Site? Today on the Roundhouse, we're going to learn that history. All aboard!
In days past, the roundhouse was where the railroad worker united with the steam locomotive, each to prepare for the journey ahead. Today, it's where we examine the history, the industry, the machines, the hobby, and the passion behind railroading. News, interviews, stories, and more. So climb aboard. This is The Roundhouse.
Welcome to The Roundhouse. I'm your host, Nick Ozarek, and this is episode number 110 of our Trains and Railroading podcast, where we're talking about everything in the industry and the hobby, you name it, and we discuss it. Today, we are talking to Rick Kfoury. He's the author of Trains of Yesteryear, the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern Story, which discusses the early life of Steamtown, when even before it was a park, even before it was Steamtown, USA in Bellows Falls, Vermont, it was a tourist operation. We're going to talk with Rick about that history, which has some fascinating turns, and I think there's some takeaways that pertain to rail preservation today, after which I will be reviewing the book and talking about what I thought of it as a whole. Before we do that, though, I want to thank everybody who is supporting the Roundhouse podcast on Patreon. For even as little as $1 a month, your support goes a long way to helping the show to grow. So thank you very much for your support. Our guest today is the author of Trains of Yesteryear, the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern Story. Please welcome to the Roundhouse, Mr. Rick Kfoury.
Hey, Nick. Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
This book, I must say, I really appreciate you reaching out to me about this book, because it was quite a read about this early period of something that a lot of us know quite a bit about its modern incarnation, Steamtown National Historic Site in Scranton, Pennsylvania. We've had Superintendent Debbie Conway on the show to talk about Steamtown in the modern era. But to talk about its formation and the early era of Steamtown and explore that in depth is something that was really a lot of fun to read. So I suppose as good a place as any to start is, who was F. Nelson Blount?
Well, Blount was really one of the foremost, and I think one of the most significant characters in the last 75 years of railroading in this country, especially on a tourist and private level. Basically, he was born in Warren, Rhode Island, in New England, southern New England, in 1918, and he was brought up in the area of the New Haven Railroad. So that's kind of where he grew his love for the railroad. His family was involved in the ice business, so he was involved in industry at a very young age, kind of exposed to that lifestyle. And they were a middle-class family. He was well-to-do, but certainly not at the level he would be later on in his life. But sort of he grew up in this time period after World War I, when the railroads were a little exhausted from the First World War, but certainly were still strong and stronger than they would be later on in his life. So he was exposed to this in the best possible way, basically. He would go down to the yard and get rides with the switchmen, and actually developed a close friendship with one of the switchmen who would later work for him in his life. So it was kind of a neat way to grow up. And he met a fellow rail fan named Fred Richardson, who was actually a schoolmate of his, and they didn't really know they were both into trains. And they actually skipped school one day to go see the Royal Scot, which was on its way to the World's Fair, and it had stopped in Providence on the way. So they went to look at it, and they saw each other there, and they kind of, it's that moment when you realize somebody else that you know is just as crazy about trains as you are, and it just started this lifelong friendship between the two. And they had a really interesting story. They would bomb around New England at first on motorcycles and later on a roadster. and they would go visit steam railroads all over New England, particularly the 2-foot gauge, narrow gauge railroads up in Maine. And they ended up writing a book together, one of the first popular books on railroading and rail fanning, called Along the Iron Trail. Fred Richards did most of the writing, and Nelson helped with research and reaching out to people and making connections. He was very good at making connections. He was a very charismatic person. So because of that, and during World War II, he went into business supplying ice to military camps, and eventually got into the seafood business and started supplying seafood to the military and other places, and built up a fortune that way. And that led to contracts with Campbell Soup after the war. So he made a lot of money. By the time he was 30, he was a millionaire. And with this money, he looked around at the steam world, not only steam locomotives and railroading, but steam tractors and steam fire engines and stationary steam engines, and wanted to preserve as much of that world as he could. And he ended up amassing one of the largest private collections of steam equipment, locomotives, and everything else probably the country has ever seen, possibly the world. And as the 1950s came around, he acquired the Edaville Railroad, which had actually been formed in Massachusetts using a lot of the 2-foot gauge equipment he had seen up in Maine. So he was familiar with that, and it was a way for him to save what he had seen disappearing in front of his eyes. So really an interesting person with a dynamic character. He had charisma. He had a very strong personality. He was somebody that went after something he believed in very heavily, and committed a lot of his own time and resources to it. And in ways that kind of attracted a lot of people, in some ways that pushed some people away. And so you see a lot of people today discuss Nelson Blount, either with heavy, praise for what he did, and sometimes you see it with criticism for certain parts of his personality. He wasn't, as far as I could tell from researching, he was a very friendly person. He was very open, always willing to share. But he had some things that he was steadfast on that, other people, trying to go after this locomotive when, it wasn't maybe a good idea or something like that. He was a very determined person. And later on in his life, he got very involved in evangelical religion after his wife had a very close car accident. And that piece of his life was something he was very devoted to. And when you're that involved in something like that, you're either very involved in it or you're very not involved in it. Or sometimes you're middle of the road and don't care either way. There were certainly plenty of people that were like that. But there are those that saw his devotion to that as sort of a turnoff too. So oftentimes you'll see some criticism about that part of his life. So just a very interesting person. But in the end, he was somebody that truly cared about these things, railroads very much included. He had the foresight to do something about it, and he did. And basically, essentially, he's the cornerstone to the whole story. His contributions are something that we're always going to be benefiting from. But in some ways, that also kind of doomed his specific plan, as we'll discuss. But all in all, Nelson really deserves the credit given to him. And I think there should absolutely be a portrait or a statue or something at Steamtown today, because none of that would be there if it wasn't for him.
People of passion like that, where they do anything that they do and they believe in, they go in full bore. And that seems to be the impression that I get of him in terms of the devotion to his vision of Steamtown, the MS&N, religion, airplane flying. He had all these things, and he didn't stop halfway. He'd go all the way with that. And I imagine that being around a person like that, if you agree with them 100%, then that's fantastic. But I think a lot of times that can be difficult. Obviously, he had friends. He had believers, not just people who also believed in Christianity, but also people who believed in his vision. So it ultimately worked. But I can imagine why that would cause some strain in certain cases.
Yeah, for sure. And, but I think, people's perception of Nelson was very person to person. One of the people that's really interesting is Robert Adams, who was Nelson's first employee, his second in command. He ended up being the president of the Green Mountain Railroad. He was a Rutland man, just about as New England as you can get. And Robert Adams was close to Nelson from about 1960 until his death. And Bob Adams said, you'll see a lot of people give criticism towards Nelson, especially for the religion piece, but there was a really positive piece of it that Adams saw, and that it made him an easier person to deal with. Before, Nelson was a bit of a helicopter boss. He was very involved in things, certainly had strong opinions about the way things should be run and handled. And after that, he sort of loosened up a little bit and started letting other people take care of things, delegating certain tasks to people. He had that ability, which was really powerful. A lot of people don't have that. If you don't know how to do something, you find somebody that does. And he had that ability. So I think the negative views that people have of Nelson Blount, oftentimes they're not really fully considering all the things he had to deal with, and just all the things that went along with it. I think it's really a person-to-person outlook.
The 50s and 60s were the times when rail preservation was really taking hold as a concept. You started seeing the first tourist railroads emerging in the UK and the US, but it was still very early days in the concept of it and how you did it. When you look at the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern, and eventually Steamtown USA, given that there are a number of movements that were going on this time, what makes Steamtown and the MSN unique in rail preservation?
There's definitely similarities and there's definitely differences. I think the similarities are very clear. I mean, these were pioneers. This was like uncharted territory. It was all bare bones. Everything they were working with was mostly secondhand equipment. And that's true for basically all tourist railroads in this time period. A lot of them were operating on track leases. They weren't operating on track that they owned, which brought a whole bunch of problems, especially for the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern. But these were operations that were staffed by a combination of railroad veterans, kids, area people, businessmen, and leaders from the local areas. And that's true for the Strasburg Railroad. That's true for the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern. That's true for later tourist railroads like the Wolfboro. So that's kind of very similar, all in this early, very colorful, very interesting time period. But the differences are very stark as well. The Monadnock Steamtown and Northern, which we can discuss this later, but it was distinct from Steamtown USA. They were two completely different operations, and they oftentimes get confused. But Nelson was the leader of that, and that's very unique for this time period. A lot of times you didn't see these very well-known, very famous, very public people that were wealthy get this involved in something like this. So they had this unique president, this new unique person at the helm of everything. Another thing that's unique about it is New England. New England, there wasn't a lot of tourist preservation in terms of standard gauge steam at this time. You had the Cog Railway, which isn't standard gauge, but that had been around for about a century at this point in time. Clark's Trading Post, the White Mountain Central in New Hampshire, had just gotten started in the mid-50s. But the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern was really the first standard gauge steam operation in northern New England, and certainly on the Boston and Maine. And that was really unique because they came into this area that had been traditionally run by the Boston and Maine only, and they started to offer different operations in these different places. And another thing that's really unique about the Monadnock Steamtown Northern is that they had kind of a traveling show feel for their first few seasons, being that the first season, which was on the Claremont and Concord Railway, which is absolutely one of the most beautiful, strange, and interesting stories of early steam preservation, I think, that's out there. And then later on in the 60s, you get the Green Mountain Railroad coming out of it, the Steamtown USA, all the political squabbles that come. So it's a very unique and strange story in the greater backdrop of the 1960s, which was essentially the decade of railroad preservation. I mean, that's really when they started building on the things that had started in the 50s.
Blount has these experiences with steam railroading in his youth. He experiences the main two-footers, a lot of which disappeared. Fortunately, some preserved, in no small part due to him. What was his vision forming to be as he's acquiring these pieces of equipment. And how did that lead to the formation of both the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern and Steamtown USA?
Yeah, to watch the progression of Nelson's interest in his collection is really fascinating. In the early 50s, when he started really getting involved with this, it kind of started out as sort of like a kid getting into something and then slowly getting more and more and more into it. I mean, there's a great picture that the family sent me when I was working on this book. I actually was able to connect with the Blount family, and they sent me the photo collections, and there's some unbelievable stuff in there. But there's a great shot of Nelson in the basement sitting next to a big Lionel train set, this elaborate Lionel train set. And a friend of mine is into Lionel, and he said, that stuff was really expensive that he had in that basement. I mean, this was like top of the line post-war Lionel stuff. So you can kind of see that's where he started, and then he kind of expanded into standard gauge at first, and then he said, okay, well, the Edaville Railroad, that's 2 foot. That's not where I want to be, but hey, I remember this from when I was up in Maine. Ellis Atwood passed away. He was the one that started the Edaville. So there's an opportunity to get into real railroading here. So he got into the narrow gauge stuff. And then the Boston and Maine starts getting rid of a lot of their equipment, so they give him the 1455 260 Mogul and some passenger cars. And from there, it just snowballs. I mean, he starts buying stuff left and right. He goes up to Canada. There's pictures of him with Fred Richardson in Mexico, South America. They go to England. And they're globetrotting, literally, like Indiana Jones, tracking down these artifacts of railroading, and in the most case, saving them where they can. And that was his vision at first, was to just build up and save as much as he can. And this was expensive stuff. I mean, he bought the 47 in 1959 for $2,000, which is about $18,000 today. And he bought the Mountaineer, which is the diner car from the Boston and Maine, for $9,000, which is about $82,000 today. So, I mean, he was spending a lot of money doing this. It wasn't chump change. And then he started to get the idea of, how can I take all this stuff that I've accumulated and present it to the world that's going in a way that's going to give back to future generations who weren't lucky like me and got to go up to Maine and see the Sandy River and Rangy Lakes Railroad. And that's where his vision started. How can I take all of this and give back to the world and let this era sort of survive forever? And that's where the plan for Steamtown USA, which was the museum only, came from. And his idea was to have a museum, a working roundhouse and back shop. There was going to be a functioning tourist railroad, which was the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern, replica New England Village with possibly a trolley and maybe a steamboat eventually on the Connecticut River, sort of a combination of what Steamtown is today with maybe a slight touch of what Clark's Trading Post is, sort of that theme park, just a little touch of that. And the reason it didn't work is because he always had an emphasis on public funds. There was always going to be public money in this. A lot of people say Steamtown should be private. Steamtown would never have worked publicly. It's not working now publicly. Some people believe that, but public funds was always essential to his plans. And when Keene, New Hampshire didn't work out because the state of New Hampshire lost interest in the funding of it, he realized that it was going to have to be funded by his money alone with a nonprofit foundation behind it. And that's where you start to see Steamtown of today emerge, is sort of this realization that his grand scheme was never going to be as good as he wanted it to after 1962, after New Hampshire killed what could have been his dream. And when he died at age 49 and on August 31st, 1967, a lot of his plans were never realized. And because he died and didn't really have any express will, a lot of those plans never happened. And Steamtown kind of forged through the 70s on its own into the 80s. And then when they decided to move to Scranton, because they had to get out of Vermont, there was various reasons why. Then you start to see the public money come back into it. And thankfully, the government stepped in, and we have today a piece of what Nelson dreamed of, and that never would have happened. So it's really an interesting progression, but it really is a 20, 30-year story that's just stretched out over all these different geographic areas, and different characters come in and out of the story. So that manifestation of Steamtown today is a long, long process.
It's amazing how many twists and turns the story takes, even within those first 7-8 years of development that is the primary focus of your book. First clear theme that emerges of his thinking post Edaville and realizing how difficult it was to get standard gauge equipment to Edaville was setting up base in North Walpole, New Hampshire. And while he's waiting for this funding to coalesce for the Steamtown USA Museum piece, he wants to get going on excursions. And that leads to the 1961 season. What were the pieces that were put into place, and how did that season go ultimately?
Yeah, like I said before, I truly believe that the 61 operation, in my opinion, is the most interesting facet of this story, and probably one of the most interested and misunderstood and underrepresented tourist rare adventures in the history of this country. It really was such an interesting situation. And basically what it boiled down to was his original plan was to run Canadian National 464T number 47 and his fleet of yellow wooden Boston and Maine, former Boston and Maine coaches on the Cheshire branch of the Boston and Maine, which ran from North Walpole to South Ashburnham, Massachusetts. And he wanted to run on the Cheshire from North Walpole to Keene, which is where the Steamtown Museum was hopefully going to open. The problem is that the Boston and Maine didn't have a labor agreement which would have allowed Monadnock Steamtown and Northern crews to operate their own trains on the Cheshire at that point in time. So 1961 comes around, June 1961, and they don't have a place to operate. And there's a great article, one of the newspaper articles that I used, and the headline is, they have tracks, they have trains, but no place to operate. And Nelson had been down at Causeway Street in Boston, which is where the offices for the Boston and Maine were located. And he had just had a meeting with the B&M, and they basically said, we can't do it quick enough. We're going to try to maybe later in the summer, maybe we can get you in. And time's burning, money's burning. Keep in mind that, they don't have any place to run. They're spending money to refurbish the coaches. They spent money to overhaul, to do inspections on 47 and do work on 47, but they don't have any place to run to make revenue. So he stops in the offices of the Claremont and Concord Railway, which just happened to be in the same building as the Boston and Maine. And he had a discussion with Samuel Pinsley, who was sort of a short line magnate. He had bought various short lines in New England. And the Claremont and Concord Railway was a former B&M branch line between Claremont and Concord. And Nelson says to Sam Pinsley, hey, is there any way we can operate on your trackage? And Pinsley said yes. So they take all the equipment up to Claremont Junction from North Walpole. They go up the Con River main line of the Boston and Maine behind a local freight. And then they set out from Claremont Junction to Bradford, which is on the Claremont branch. And all the way from Claremont Junction to Bradford, you have a steam locomotive pulling 9 coaches, an old Rutland boxcar, a couple cabooses. And people just couldn't believe what they were seeing. I mean, kids were coming out of lake houses along Lake Sunapee. It was evening by the time they got through there. And they couldn't believe it. They were rubbing their eyes. They still had their pajamas on. So that's how they ended up at Bradford in 1961. And the Bradford story is just so interesting because they thought it was going to last for the whole season into the fall, but it ended up only lasting 8 total weeks with only 5 weeks of steam operations. So the story of how they got there is really interesting, but the story of what happened once they got there is even crazier, honestly.
There are some really amusing anecdotes about how they were running around, the crew was running around trying to get ready at the last minute to have excursions ready to go as soon as they possibly could, and all of these last minute preparations. And there's something really amusing about that era of tourism, of just flying by the seat of your pants and hoping it works and making it work. To be able to have something as unique as that going, especially with number 47, which is a 464 tank engine. So it's a big for a tank engine that was well suited for what was being required of it. And then this is a good place to talk about Patrick Webb's question. What assumptions do people make about Steamtown that researching the book disproves? Number 47 is, I think, a good place to start in exploring one of the long-held myths about a piece of Steamtown equipment.
Yeah, no, I'm glad we're talking about this, and I think you're going to have an exclusive. This is the first time this has been sort of discussed vocally, so I'm really excited to talk about this. But I do want to backtrack just a tiny bit and talk about the preparations for the season. You're right; it was what's going to work. I mean, there's a story about they needed an air compressor, so they went down to Keene and got an air compressor, and they had to use one of Nelson's dump trucks, which some farmers had used for manure, and it's such a great story. And then they're fixing up these old ratty Boston and Maine wooden coaches that don't have any seats in them. So they go and buy some church pews in Peterborough and throw them in there. And one coach has benches and one coach has, folding chairs. And the state of New Hampshire says, yeah, but you got to have something in the window. There's no glass. So they run a wall conduit pipe, a tube down the inside of the coach just so they have something in the windows. I mean, it's crazy stuff. But the 47, really, that was such an eye-opening thing for me, is finding out what happened with the 47. And basically, the story of the 47 is that it was a Canadian National tank engine, like you said, a huge beefy tank engine that the CN used for commuter rail in Montreal. It had been built by the Grand Trunk and eventually was acquired by the Canadian National and all that. And this engine had been retired in 1959, and Nelson Blount went up to Canada and bought it for $2,000. And in 1960, the Canadian National sends a letter, October 18th, 1960, 35 years to the date before I was born, actually, sends it to Nelson Blount and says, Nelson, we've got the engine ready for you, but we want to let you know that we don't have the paperwork for the engine. As such, there are several dates of maintenance that we can't identify. But we disposed of the paperwork. Now, there's the big piece there. They write, we disposed of the paperwork. Now, the common theory is that the paperwork was destroyed in a fire or lost in a fire. You see that everywhere. But to have the Canadian National say in a letter to Nelson Blount, it was disposed of, implies that they got rid of it intentionally and it wasn't lost in a fire. So right there's a red flag. So Nelson gets the engine, they bring it to North Walpole, and they start doing work on it. They do inspections on it. They do a hydrostatic test. They do all the work they need to on the engine. It's in good shape. It does what it needs to. No problems. The Hartford Steam Boiler Company comes up and does a test on it. Good shape, no problems there. So they bring it up to Bradford, and they put it into service on July 22nd, 1961. We're about 7 days from the 60th anniversary. And they run it. No problems to report, no issues whatsoever. And then August 25th, an ICC inspector comes to the railroad, John Wilkie, and he notices that the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern inspection report from July 1961, right before the season started, is missing the first 4 dates of maintenance. So the last time 4 things were maintained. And he says, no, you got to take the engine out of service. You have to account for all the maintenance pieces. And he was doing his job, and he did it well, and they took the engine out of service. So Nelson and the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern are in a fit here because they don't have a steam locomotive. Steam Trains of Yesteryear doesn't really hold up if you don't have a steam train. So Nelson contacts Canada. He contacts the Canadian National. He says, can you find the paperwork? And the Canadian National contacts the Board of Transit Commissioners in Canada. And they have copies of the paperwork. So the paperwork did exist. There were copies up in Canada. Canadian National gets the copies. They send the copies to Nelson Blount. Great. They have the dates that they're missing. Unfortunately, the paperwork that they get also says that the locomotive had been due for retubing in 1958 and that the Canadian National applied for and was given an extension so they wouldn't have to do the tubing on the locomotive. And then in 1959, they retire it. So the tubing was never done on the engine. And so, as a result, now the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern is going to need to retube the locomotive. And they didn't want to do that. It was going to be too expensive. So they canceled the season early. And that's what happened. But we know that there was no fire, as far as I can tell from the research I've done, because A, it's never mentioned between any of the parties involved. Not between the Canadian National, not between the Board of Transit Commissioners, not between the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern. The only fire I can find a real record of was in 1948 at Bonaventure Yard in Montreal. That was 10 years before the engine was taken out of service by the Canadian National. So even if its paperwork was lost in 1948, there's no way they would have run it for 10 more years without records. And the final piece, which is the absolute strangest thing, one of the strangest things that's ever happened to me, is while I was writing the book, a friend of mine was going through some paperwork, and the paperwork had been given to him by a prominent rail fan that had gone up to Montreal in 1958. And on top of the stack of paperwork was a sealed envelope. And my friend's girlfriend says, "Hey, what's in the envelope?" And he says, "I don't know. I've never opened it." So they open it up, and inside is the missing inspection report for 47 from 1958. So I assume that when this rail fan went up to Montreal, the CN just gave it to him because they weren't expecting the engine to ever run again. So it's wild. It's just unbelievable. But you heard it here first. As far as I can tell, there was no fire. And the thing that drives me nuts is since this book was published, 2 other books have come out that mention the Bradford operation, and they both say there was a fire. So we have a lot of work to do.
Debunking myths could be tricky when these stories take hold, and especially when they're very sensational, involving an accident or a fire or something like that. It's so much catchier than somebody decided to throw it out, which is the disposition of 99% of historic railroad artifacts.
Exactly. And the funny thing is that a fire is so commonly used as an excuse for why things get lost. And I think the source of that comes from some newspaper articles in 1961 that did mention there was a fire. So I think they just were trying to find a way to explain it. And then there's a video, Twilight of Steam, which was sort of my first exposure to the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern. It has some footage of 47 and 61, and they mention the fire there. So I think some of those things for the last 60 years are sort of perpetuating that myth forward.
Well, we'll work to get the word out that it was not a fire and that there are a number of documents proving that.
But the true story is even better, though. That's the thing. It's better than the fire story. It's just you just got to do a little research. That's all.
And it gives those of us who are fans of Canadian steam hope that 47 can one day be returned to service. And that would certainly be fun to see because it is such a unique piece of steam railroading technology. There's not a huge assortment of large commuter style steam locomotives that are around in preservation. So it gets sidelined, and that means that it becomes a diesel operation for the rest of that season. What is going into the 1962 season like for the MSNN crew?
Well, the 1962 season is really interesting, and I think there was a similar doubt in Nelson's mind that the Boston and Maine was going to play ball here because in early 1962, Nelson sends a letter to Sam Pinsley of the Claremont and Concord and says, "We're working on another small steam locomotive," which was Rahway Valley 15. And he said, "Is there any way we can operate for another season on your trackage up at Lake Sunapee?" And Sam Pinsley talks to the board of directors of the Claremont Concord, and they say no. And I believe the reason they say no is probably because I think Sam Pinsley and the Claremont Concord were planning on abandoning the trackage from Bradford to Newport, which they did in 1964. So I think that's the reason they didn't want to commit to more tourism. It may have been because of the situation with the 47 as well. But basically, it was all systems go for what they wanted to do originally, which was to operate on the Cheshire branch of the Boston and Maine. And they get permission from the B&M to operate their own equipment out of Keene, New Hampshire, which is sort of the population center of southwest New Hampshire, to operate out of Keene through the Summit Cut to the village of Gilboa, which is part of the town of Westmoreland, New Hampshire. And they get going in July 1962. The city of Keene is all guns blazing with this. I mean, that part of New Hampshire has historically not gotten the amount of state funding and attention as the rest of the state. So they were all for any sort of tourist attraction. Keene was behind it. The mayor was behind it. A lot of the local politicians were behind it. And initially, in 1962, the state government was behind it. Not only the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern, which they really didn't have any say in because that was operating on the B&M, but the big piece that they had a say in was the creation of Steamtown USA in Keene, which was going to be a state-funded and operated museum with Nelson Blount's owned Monadnock Steamtown and Northern providing the excursions on the Cheshire branch. And there's a lot of optimism there's a lot of hope, but foot dragging just continues. And the Boston and Maine initially says, we'll explore selling you the Cheshire branch, because the state wanted to own the railroad line. They didn't want to have the excursion line under the control of a railroad that might abandon it out from under them. So the state really wanted either Nelson Blount or the state to control the Cheshire branch. And the Boston and Maine finally, in late 62, agrees to explore that. And they start drawing up a sale agreement and everything. And people are kind of wondering what's going on. Is it really going to happen? And then in late 62, you have state elections. And a lot of the people, including the governor that supported the Steamtown Museum in Keene, got voted out of office. And at first, the new government was going to honor the arrangement that had been set up. But eventually, the Boston and Maine is still dragging their feet on a sale agreement for the Cheshire branch. And the state just decides to save face and pull out. And there was a lot of pressure from other parts of the state, newspapers and that sort of thing. And unfortunately, if this had happened about 10 years later, it may have happened, because the state of New Hampshire at that time was not involved in the purchase and operation of railroad lines. But 10 years later, they would be. And that's when you start to see like the Hobel Railroad and the Winnipesaukee Scenic Railroad and the Conway Scenic Railroad, which operate on state-owned lines. But in the early 60s, there was no precedent for state-owned railroad lines in New Hampshire. So as a result, the 62 season basically ended, and they ended up exactly where they were at the end of the 61 season, basically.
It's amazing how some things never change. We think of the politics involved in making rail preservation work to be more of a modern thing. I think there's this image, especially folks of our generation, to look at rail preservation and go, back in the 60s and 70s, folks just said they wanted to do it. They got engines out of parks and they did it. And I appreciate the fact that this book illustrates that the challenges of private-public partnerships go back decades and have been there since day one of rail preservation.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a tiny shred of truth to that spirit of, hey, back then they could do what they wanted wherever they wanted, because you had a lot more places where you could run trains. So, I mean, the Cheshire branch is gone. The Claremont and Concord branch is gone. Back then you could set up a tourist railroad on an unwanted section of track, but it's true that it was a lot more difficult than people make it out to be. And I mean, this is the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern is such a great example of that. I mean, you have this tourist railroad, they have equipment, they have money, they have a determined leader, and despite all of that, they couldn't get off the ground. I mean, they were popular excursions. People rode them. There was publicity. They used the equipment in a movie, a Hollywood film. I mean, this stuff is popular, but despite all that success, there's still failure at the end of it. And it's interesting too, is that there are some operations out there that didn't have money. They didn't have a Nelson Blount. They didn't have 40 steam engines to draw from, but they ended up extremely successful, like the Conway Scenic Railroad, for example. So the rail preservation, the successes and failures of rail preservation do not follow a standard template. And you can't just copy and paste what worked at one place and say it's going to work somewhere else, because there's so many factors, state involvement, railroad involvement, local government, local politics, geography, weather. There's so many pieces that just come into it that it's impossible to say for sure what could happen.
Part of the winding, twisting nature of the Steamtown story saw the creation of a freight carrier in the form of the Green Mountain Railroad. What led to the creation of that?
Yeah, the interesting thing about this story is that I went into it with an express interest in the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern, because they had operated on these these branch lines that are close to where I live, places that I recognize. So that's kind of where I went in with an interest, but I soon realized that you have to talk about the museum, Steamtown USA, and you have to talk about the Green Mountain Railroad, because those three operations are all joined around the common theme of Nelson Blount. And basically the Green Mountain Railroad is a story unto of itself, and there's a wonderful book about it that's been written by Bob Nimke in the 80s. But I wanted to kind of cover the story of how the Green Mountain came to be and why it came to be and how it related to the MSNN and Steamtown. And basically, the Rutland Railroad, which was a really interesting railroad in New England, but troubled, went out of business and abandoned its entire system in the early 60s as a result of declining business, as a result of employee strikes. So in the early 60s, the Rutland system, which stretched across most of Vermont, was up for grabs. And the state of Vermont was very worried about what was going to happen to the Rutland Railroad because there were still a lot of online customers back then. There was a lot of reliance on the railroad for jobs and industry. And so the governors of Vermont, Ray Keyser at first, and eventually Bob Hoff, sort of led the charge in finding operators for the old Rutland Railroad. And the first one was the Vermont Railway, which was established by J. Wolfson, who came up from New Jersey and sort of established this successful short line regional freight railroad on the remnants of the Rutland. But the section of the Rutland from Rutland to Bellows Falls, the Bellows Falls subdivision, was unspoken for. Wolfson didn't want it. The state needed to find an operator for it. And so Nelson Blount is fresh off of his failure in Keene to start the Steamtown USA Museum, and he's looking for a place to build his museum. And he's also looking for a place to run his Monadnock Steamtown and Northern, the tourist railroad. And so he realizes that this Rutland Railroad remnant is up for grabs and starts talking with Vermont about establishing Steamtown somewhere on the former Bellows Falls subdivision with passenger operations on that line as well. And this was advantageous for Blount because not only would it allow him complete control over the track he was operating on, other than state involvement at a very low level, but he would also have real estate to build his museum. So Vermont was looking very attractive in late 62, early 63. And so he started into talks with Vermont about taking over that trackage. And very quickly, it was very clear that Nelson initially was not interested in freight railroading. He was basically a passenger guy. And some of his employees, namely Bob Nimke, Robert Adams, and Robert Ashcroft, who had Rutland Railroad experience, Bob Ashcroft and Bob Adams, the three Bobs is what they were called, basically went to Nelson and said, look, if you establish a freight railroad on this line that you're looking at, it will not only allow the customers to finally get service again after almost 3 years, but you'll also be creating an employment opportunity for your tourist railroad employees because, as a lot of people know, a lot of tourist railroads don't operate in the wintertime, especially in New England. So they would go through about 7 or 8 months of wages, and then in the wintertime would have to do little tasks here and there and try to get by. So this would give the employees a chance to work year round. And so after some political squabbles, especially considering the Boston and Maine was also interested in that trackage, finally in late 64, Vermont gives the green light to establish the Green Mountain Railroad. And in early 65, they have their first freight run. So now Nelson Blount is technically in control of a tourist railroad, a railroad museum, and a freight railroad, even though he designated a lot of the Green Mountain responsibilities to Robert Adams.
One of my favorite anecdotes of the book has to do with Blount's ability to get his equipment for the tourist railroad operation across the Boston and Maine, Connecticut River Division, which is just a little crossover, not a big deal, but the B&M dragging their feet and not wanting to see it happen. I love the story of how he was able to get his equipment from North Walpole onto the Green Mountain Railroad. I'm wondering if you could share that with us.
Yeah, it's a really cool story, and it's been discussed a couple times before in other books, but it's really fascinating what happened. So in 1963, the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern operates out of the North Walpole facility, again on the Cheshire branch, but this time they go in the opposite direction between North Walpole and Westmoreland. And they establish the Steamtown Museum at North Walpole, but they realize very quickly that parking and space is limited. So meanwhile, Nelson is talking to Vermont about establishing the Green Mountain Railroad and establishing a Steamtown Museum in Vermont. And they identify a spot called Riverside, which is a couple miles upriver on the Vermont side from Bellows Falls. North Walpole, Bellows Falls are opposite each other. North Walpole, New Hampshire, and Bellows Falls, Vermont. So they set up basically in what's a field, a small little station with bathroom facilities and that sort of thing at Riverside. But all of the equipment they need, the 15, the 280 consolidation, the coaches, the caboose, are still in North Walpole, New Hampshire. And in order to get them from the yard at North Walpole, which was at the end of the B&M Cheshire branch, to the start of the Green Mountain Railroad, was to cross over the Boston and Maine's Connecticut River main line, which runs north-south along the Connecticut River. And the B&M was not too happy at Blount because they wanted to take over the Rutland Railroad trackage for their own. So they would not let Nelson run his own equipment over B&M property to reach the Green Mountain Railroad. So the Rutland Railroad actually at this point in time still exists because their assets hadn't been taken over by the state of Vermont. So the Rutland Railroad, it's basically a board of directors and one engine. That's all that's left. Everything else has been sold or is getting sold. And the only engine was RS1 number 405, still lettered up in Rutland and everything. And in 1964, the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern had been leasing the engine to perform maintenance work on the Rutland line in anticipation of operating their trains there in 1964. So what happened was Nelson Blount was down in Boston at a meeting with the B&M brass. And the Rutland Railroad calls Nelson the night before and says, look, we know your equipment is stranded in North Walpole. We know your operation starts tomorrow and you don't have your equipment yet. So we will send 405 over the diamond at Bellows Falls, over the Conn River, across the Connecticut River into North Walpole, take all the equipment you need and drag it over to Riverside so you have everything you need for tomorrow. And Nelson says, let's do it. So one of the very last actions of the once great Rutland Railroad is to clandestinely sneak across the Boston and Maine's Conn River line at like 4:00 in the morning, go over the Connecticut River, get all the stuff that Nelson needs, and then drag it safely into Vermont onto the Green Mountain Railroad. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. It's unbelievable.
No, the amount of things that you come across in the book, and I'm sure those that you came across in your research, that you go, this feels like the plot to one of those feel-good movies about the plucky gang that believed that they could do it but were thwarted by XY forces or try to be thwarted. You read it and you go, no, that didn't really happen, but it really did. And unfortunately, one of the biggest twists in the story was the unfortunate untimely passing of Blount himself on August 31st, 1967, as the result of a plane crash. You talk a lot about how there's the fallout as far as people figuring out what they needed to do. What's the larger picture in terms of the impact that had on the direction that Steamtown USA and the MSNN had been going up to that point in time?
Yeah, it gets messy. And honestly, one of the hardest parts of the book was kind of going through all the sources that I referenced and getting the story right. And what basically ended up happening was Nelson Blount was always the central figure of this story in his lifetime. And in 1963, he had established the Steamtown Foundation after the state of New Hampshire killed the Keene Plan to oversee the collection. And they actually acquired all of his collection. So, I mean, he owned various pieces still, but most of his collection was acquired by the foundation to sort of manage it and operate it. And if you look at the board of directors of Steamtown Foundation, I mean, there's like the president of Campbell Soup, like the CEO of Radio Free America, Spencer Miller, who was the president of the Maine Central. A lot of these people were not really that involved in the actual foundation itself. One of the big exceptions was Robert Mallett, who was the mayor of Keene, sort of the big champion for Steamtown, having been in Keene. He was only 30 years old actually when he was mayor. But a lot of those guys were basically kind of involved for various reasons, but not for a lot of reasons. Like, for example, Spencer Miller's involvement is how they ended up with the two Maine Central consolidations, 501 and 519. So a lot of that was let's get people on the board of directors so, maybe they'll donate stuff, or, maybe they'll be involved in the museum in some capacity. But other than that, Nelson was very central to the direction of Steamtown with his vision and his funding. And there was no real funding other than the revenue they were making and Nelson's own checks. I mean, honestly, almost everything you see in this book, almost a huge majority of what you see down in Scranton, he wrote checks for out of his own pocket. So he was that important to it. He was important for PR. He was important for going around and spreading the word. An absolute essential figure. And when he's killed in a field off Old Chesham Road in Dublin, New Hampshire, or Marlborough, New Hampshire, rather, right near the Dublin line, he doesn't have a will necessarily. He doesn't have an outlined plan of what's going to happen to Steamtown. He doesn't have any sort of alternative funding set up or anything like that. And so I know some people give him crap for that, but honestly, who thinks they're going to die at 49 years old? So it really wasn't something he envisioned happening. But we do know that right before he died, he talked to Fred Richardson that the stresses were really getting to him of operating 3 operations. I mean, he's still involved at Blount Seafood down in Rhode Island. He's got a family. He's got his ministry that he's involved with. So he was really starting to feel the effects of all the failures and all the disappointments and all the letdowns. And he was looking at transitioning out of the central role, finding somebody else to become chairman that could be a better fundraiser than he was, and really only being an engineer. That's really all he ever wanted to do, was to share his love and to be an engineer. And so he has this conversation with Fred Richardson the week before he dies about him getting out. And the person he highlights as a potential candidate for taking over after he gets out is Edgar Mead, who was a pretty prominent railroad author, and he had also been the superintendent of the Bridgeton and Saco River, also later the Bridgeton and Harrison narrow gauge railroad up in Maine. He had known Nelson since the 30s, so he was the person that Nelson sort of had favorite for that role. And after he's killed, the board of directors votes Edgar Mead in, and Edgar Mead runs Steamtown until the early 70s. And Edgar Mead has a lot of great quotes about the direction Steamtown was going in. And basically they boil down to, after Nelson died, we did the best we could, but everything was Nelson. We kind of started to build structures to store the steam engines in, and that's about as far as they ever got towards Nelson's real vision. So, I mean, he was absolutely paramount to all these plans. And unfortunately, he was so busy in his life that he never really contemplated dying that soon and what would happen to everything after he was gone.
This is a philosophical question, and I'll acknowledge one that's really difficult, but I feel is still relevant when we look at rail preservation today, or any movement trying to accomplish a large goal. On the one hand, you wouldn't have Steamtown without Blount because of his using his wealth to be able to acquire all of these locomotives. But because so much of the vision was central to him, it relied so heavily on him as a driver. That seems to have its own cons associated with it as well. Then there's the team element where he certainly had a team who helped carry out the operation. He couldn't single-handedly run a train himself, no matter how much money he had. So he did have a team there. What does this story say, in your mind, about what it means to have an individual being so central to an organization in the way that Blount was?
I definitely would say that from a philosophical standpoint, it's kind of a catch-22, because you have somebody like Nelson Blount who is absolutely essential to everything that's happening, but you also have this very established cast of characters who's very capable, and they all have their own roles. So it's difficult to say whether it's better to have one person kind of overseeing everything, or have a lot of people involved, because if you have one person overseeing something, And I don't want to make it out to seem like Nelson Blount was the only person that had any say in anything, because he certainly did have the foundation and Bob Adams and a bunch of other people that had input. But as far as the funding, which was the big piece, he was one of the only sources. So I mean that Nelson had so much money, at least from his own successes, to put towards this project, that I think at some point they were sort of tentative about what to do. I mean, they weren't getting public funding from any sources they were pursuing. One of the things that Vermont said is, yeah, you can come to Vermont and we'll help you get the Rutland line, but we're not going to put any state money into this. And New Hampshire was going to put state money into it. So, do you have one person continually fund this at the same time, knowing that you're not going to get money from any other sources? Or do you try to have as many people involved as possible, but then you may have internal conflicts, you may have conflicts of interest, you may have situations where shareholders decide to back out at different points and that sort of thing. It's tough to say. I think it's situational is basically what it boils down to. I think Nelson could have had more security in place, but at the same time, I don't fault him for that because he was such a busy person. Maybe other people involved could have said something, but they all had their own things to do. By the late 60s, by 67, Bob Adams is basically running the Green Mountain Railroad, and he's basically Nelson's second in command. So, I mean, he's got his own thing to worry about, multi-season freight railroading in New England, of all things. So, yeah, it's tough to say what the right path is forward. I think ideally you would have a strong personality, a strong leader, but also have a healthy system of checks and balances and reliances that you could fall back on in a situation where you need it. And unfortunately, Steamtown USA and to an extent the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern didn't have a strong enough system of fallbacks, basically.
What takes it from this trying to keep the vision alive, but acknowledging that a key piece of that vision is now gone, to what it is today as a National Historic Site in Pennsylvania, the move and getting the National Park Service involved?
Definitely, kind of an interesting story post-Blount. The post-Blount world is very different to the world in which, he's involved. You do see some attempts right off to kind of maintain the status quo through the late 60s. Edgar Meade becomes the president. They do some steam excursions in various places. 127, the 462 Pacific, goes to various places on tour, which is things that was happening before Nelson was killed. But very soon they realized that Nelson's plan, which was, this roundhouse, backshop, village, most of that wasn't going to happen. Very soon they realized a lot of that's not going to happen. So they basically come to terms with reality and say, this is what we're stuck with. We need to find a way to make it work. So they build what structures they can to store the collection. You start to see this interesting situation where the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern had been the tourist operator before Nelson died. When Nelson dies, the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern basically ceases operations altogether, and the Green Mountain Railroad takes over passenger operations. And from what I can understand, this is something that was planned even before Nelson died. They were looking at sort of taking the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern out of the picture and having the Green Mountain Railroad handle the passenger excursions. That's why you see like 89 lettered Green Mountain right before Nelson dies, for example. So there started this internal shift where Monadnock Steamtown and Northern becomes a real estate only holding company, and the Green Mountain Railroad becomes the tourist operator. And then late 60s, the Green Mountain Railroad decides it doesn't want to handle steam operations anymore. So they transfer the responsibility to Steamtown USA. So now Steamtown USA has to maintain the collection, including during the wintertime. They have to try their best to build structures and maintain the property at Riverside. And now they have to operate steam excursions, with sometimes as many as 2 or 3 active steam locomotives at one time. So it starts to become a burden, and Edgar Meade backs out in the early 1970s, and he's replaced by Robert Barbera, whose father, Andy Barbera, was a Lackawanna engineer, ran the Phoebe Snow. And Andy Barbera the engineer, was friendly, well-liked, respected. But Robert Barbera had a completely different outlook. His outlook was very pragmatic. He wasn't a rail fan. He would say that very clearly. He was a businessman and he was a scientist. And he came in to try to keep the place afloat. And he did a pretty good job at keeping it afloat. They started doing television ads. They started doing advertisements. They had people coming in on weekends and doing extra work. So he was popular and successful at that, but what he didn't have was sort of the spirit and respect for railroading and the love for railroading that Nelson Blount had. It was on record that he did not like Nelson Blount. He didn't like Fred Richardson, who was still involved at some level. He didn't like Robert Adams. He was sort of a interesting figure. He was very pragmatic, so he wouldn't let people even go to the gates and look at the engines. If you're just passing through town, you had to buy a ticket, for example. So, he had this approach that was very strict, and it worked in some senses, but not in other senses. It wasn't a balance, whereas Nelson was very much a rail fan and very much an enthusiast, but sort of lacked that strict focus. So you have one end of the spectrum, and then a pendulum swing to the other end of the spectrum. And Barbera's out by 1980, and he's replaced by Jim Boyd, who operates the museum and the Torres Railroad up until they leave Vermont. And he starts to change things around a little bit, and he tries his best to make it work. And they get a number of engines running, but it comes very clear that Vermont was just not going to work out. They couldn't put signs up on the highway. They couldn't do a lot of things that they needed to do. They needed a more well-trafficked area for this museum to work. So they start looking around. They look at Oneonta, New York. They look again at Florida a couple times. And they decide on Scranton, Pennsylvania, with the former Lackawanna engine facility there. And 83, 84, they have an auction. They sell a decent amount of equipment that's not lined up with an American railroad museum, for example. Eventually, the three Canadian National Pacifics, 127, 1248, and there's one more, 1270. It was 1278. Yeah, there's three of them, and those got sold because they didn't necessarily match what the Scranton vision was. So they moved to Scranton. And Steamtown USA operates as a private organization in Scranton for a few years, but what ends up happening is they go bankrupt again for a variety of reasons, mostly revolving around the renovation of the facility there was too expensive, and the collection too was still sitting. So finally, the National Park Service steps in and initiates the process of acquiring the park and making it a national park under national jurisdiction. And when that finally goes through, you finally see the level of public involvement that Nelson Blount had always wanted for the collection. And that's what we have today. And that's sort of how it happened. It was sort of Nelson's vision, and then throughout the late 70s and early 80s, just trying to survive. And they found something today that works.
Ordinarily, I would assume that somebody came to the Steamtown story or exploring that by way of going to the park. It seems, though, that you have a local connection with that early history. What was it that led you to ultimately embark on writing the book?
Yeah, I mean, it basically came out of, like you said, sort of that local history piece. I'm tried and true a New England rail fan. I mean, I all the other books I've written are about New England. It's where I feel comfortable. It's where I feel connected with. But sort of that story of the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern, and to a lesser extent, the Steamtown USA Museum, was something that I had always kind of been aware of and interested in. It's like I always knew this thing had happened and had existed, but didn't really understand it fully. And the rest of the New England railroad community is very tight-knit, and everybody sort of knew these things happened. But the specifics of them was sort of there was a lot of blur as to the specifics were. And when I was a little kid, I had that VHS tape I mentioned earlier, Twilight of Steam, which I believe was a Madison Entertainment video. Had some great footage of like the Morris County Central rather, and stuff like that. And it opens with footage of the 1961 excursion with 47. And as a kid, I loved that. I mean, I would watch that tape over and over again. Something about the tank engine and the yellow coaches just stood out to me. It was very aesthetically pleasing, very interesting. And then in 2008, when I was 13, I visited Steamtown for the first time with my family, and that started to tie things together. There's 47, there's 15, there's all this stuff that I had heard about and seen in pictures and, distant posts online and stuff like that, mentioned in a couple books here and there. But I just kind of wanted to myself get to know the story and sort out some of that misinformation, which was understandable given that these were complex situations. But I wanted to kind of learn about it myself and sort of do my best to set it right and give it its first full specific focus in rich detail. And coming up on the 60th anniversary this year of the founding of the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern and the start of the 61 operation at Lake Sunapee, I felt it was the right time to help others understand what happened here was so unique and so interesting. And I mean, you have people like Bob Adams, Bob Ashcroft, Clyde Sessions, Governor Hoff. I mean, even Reverend Billy Graham shows up. I mean, these rich characters in this interesting time period, the early 60s, you've got the Cold War in the background. The folk revival is huge. The civil rights is making great strides, but still has a lot of work to do. And at the same time is this unbelievably dynamic story of New England tourist railroading, of human determination. It's really a human story when you come down to it, and that's kind of what attracted me to it.
When you decided, I'm going to commit myself to doing this, what was your process for being able to tackle such a gigantic story in terms of research and writing?
Yeah, the first thing I did was to go to locations and do some physical research. So I went to school in Keene. I went to Keene State College, so I was very familiar with where the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern had operated in their second season. But I went up to Lake Sunapee. I went to Bradford, New Hampshire. I dug around up there. I found the old siding where they used to coal 47. The rails are gone, but the retaining wall's still there. I found a chunk of coal on the ground that probably fell out of 47's bunker 60 years ago. I went to locations. I went to North Walpole. I went to Chester. And then I sort of sat down and said, okay, where am I going with this? What are the sources? I need to conceptualize all these possible sources and then pursue them exhaustively. And the first thing I did was go through newspaper article archives, search keywords. I searched for Monadnock Northern, Blount, Nelson Blount, Green Mountain, Steamtown. And I came up with several hundred newspaper articles, which I arranged chronologically and then took a Word document, went through every article and did bullet points for each article. Names, dates, people, things that are referenced, what might be true, what might be false. And that was sort of the framework for the research. And then from there, I reached out to different historical societies. So the Steamtown NHS, Pat McKnight, the archivist, was extremely helpful with that. Unfortunately, most of the key players have passed away in this story. I mean, it was 60 years ago. A lot of them were in their 30s or older. But the Steamtown NHS has interviews that were conducted in the late 90s with people like Robert Adams, with Robert Ashcroft, with Fred Richardson, with Blount's widow, Ruth Blount, and Blount's son as well, Ted Blount. So those were absolutely essential. It was basically like I was interviewing them myself. There were certain questions, of course, I couldn't ask, but a lot of the questions I needed to know were there. There was also an interview with Fred Bailey, who became important after Blount died at Steamtown, and that kind of gave me a lot of the information for the after Blount piece. They sent me paperwork on 47. They sent me that letter that the Canadian National had sent to Nelson Blount about how they had disposed of the paperwork. They've got a lot of great stuff in that archive that was super helpful. And then I tried to narrow down people that were still alive that I could talk to, people like Steve Hall, who was a fireman in 1961 at Bradford. Various people that had known Nelson Blount, people that had worked with him. I talked to Mike Lennon here in New Hampshire, who sat down with Nelson Blount for an hour in 1962 in Keene and told him about how the Seashore Trolley Museum had started a nonprofit foundation and how that might be a good idea for Nelson to help save his equipment. And that kind of planted the seed in Nelson's mind of starting the Steamtown Foundation. People like that knew them, but weren't necessarily connected with the story. And then from there, it just, bridged out to pictures and film. You've got a ton of film, 8mm film here that was super helpful. The one piece that, and you might appreciate this story, the one piece I haven't been able to locate, and this is driving me crazy, is in 1963, Nelson Blount was a guest on the game show To Tell the Truth, which was a nationally syndicated game show. All kinds of famous people were on the show. And basically the premise of the show was they have three people, one of which is the real person, and a panel of judges asks questions to try to figure out who is the actual person. So there was two fake Nelson Blounts and one real Nelson Blount. So I was like, I need to find that footage. It's got to be fantastic. But unfortunately, the show is 60 years old. There's a very small community that pays attention to it. But to make a long story short, I was able to find somebody that was able to give me contact information for the British company that owns the rights to the TV show. And they told me that there's only two places on Earth you can see that footage, UCLA in California or the British company that owns the TV show. And they're looking through their archives right now trying to find the footage. I guess COVID has kind of gotten in the way of that. But just trying to exhaust all possible sources to get a full idea of who was Nelson Blount, what was the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern, and why did all these things happen when they happened.
That would certainly be gold if found, especially to hear and see him in his own words. That would be fascinating and fun covered, and hopefully will be. Aside from that, because you are naturally limited by how much you could fit in a book, if you could write a volume 2 or expand on what you've already done, what scope would you look at if you were to try to explore the topic further?
That's a good question. I would definitely like to do a little bit of a deeper dive into the Steamtown of the 70s and early 80s when they were in Vermont. The epilogue covers that to an extent, but since the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern was no longer in the picture at that point in time, I didn't get that full into it. As far as the stuff down in Pennsylvania is concerned, it really interests me because the wonderful thing about the Steamtown story and the Nelson Blount story and the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern story is that it covers so many different people and places. And the Pennsylvania world is, first of all, it was 20 to 30 years after this book takes place. So, but it covers such a different set of situations and people. And I'd love to dive into that and learn more about it. Writing a book on it would be interesting. And I would almost want somebody that's from that area to cover it because, I don't have the same level of connection to Pennsylvania that I do to New Hampshire. The big, motivation for me to write this book was the local history. So, I would love to work with somebody down in Pennsylvania that wants to pen something like that and share what I've learned towards that end. But, if it comes down to writing that someday, I'd be open to it. Absolutely. It's all a learning experience. Hey, I didn't know any of this stuff before I went into this project, so I'm sure I would learn just as much more. But what I am working on is the concept of a companion documentary for this book. So like I mentioned, I've got, a couple hours of 8mm film from 61, 62, 63, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then into the 70s. So what I'd really like to do is, documentary film of some sort, possibly to be released through the B&M Historical Society, that has all that footage and also sound clips. There's an interview that I found with Nelson Blount, pictures that I couldn't share because the book had so many pages that I had to, fit. Documents. I mean, I would love to do something like that, just to kind of take this story and, maybe set it to music of the time period. You get so much great music here and just really cover it in a different sensory concept than you can get in the book.
Last question that I have for you, Rick. When people read your book and they learn more about this niche story, we'll call it, what do you hope they take away from it the most?
I think sort of aside from the, the nuts and bolts of the history, what happened, where it happened, the differences between Steamtown and the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern. I think basically the story I want to impart upon people is that, this is such an interesting period of history that's sadly becoming distant. I mean, 60 years is a long time. And, this being the 60th anniversary this year, there's not a lot of people around that were there. I mean, there's barely anybody that was there working, and there's hardly any people that were there, at least in 60, 61 that can remember being there. And so part of what I wanted to impart upon this, especially the younger generation, is that if you feel a connection to a period of history, whether it's trains or anything else, and you want to explore it, dive into it head first, because you're going to learn so much, and you're going to find a connection to that, that time period. I mean, I will never pull up at Bradford, New Hampshire in the summer of 1961 in a station wagon with the Kingston Trio on the radio. But, writing about that time period and getting involved with pictures and video and interviews and documents, you are in a way transported to that time period. And that's kind of what I wanted to impart on the reader, not only so they can experience it, but so they can try to experience the things that they're interested in a similar capacity.
That's an interesting way of considering it, to be mindful of not just the story in the bubble of railroad history, but thinking about the social and cultural history of New England, of our country as a whole, and how that all ties together, and how we take for granted the history that we're creating today, that we're part of, and the railroading that we're involved with, but then the larger pieces of our current society, our current culture, and how that goes into the picture of railroading and rail preservation today.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've got something there. I mean, as attractive as the past can be when it comes to the things that were there that are gone now, make history now, because the things that we're experiencing now, 60 years from now, people are going to be writing books about. We forget that. We get caught up in the moment. So, it's like, Ferris Bueller. If you don't stop or, to look around every once in a while, you might miss it, because there's a lot that we're seeing now that's just as important as this. So yeah, look back with a historical lens, but at the same time, keep an eye on where you are now and how important that's going to be, and do everything you can to keep nuggets of that alive for future generations to then look back on.
Very sage advice. Rick, thank you so much for joining us here on the show and talking about this amazing story. Steam Trains of Yesteryear, the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern Society, is available from the Boston, Maine Railroad Historical Society. There will be a link in the show notes where you can get the book, or you can just Google search that name. Rick, thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
As rail fans, most of us are familiar with the modern incarnation of Steamtown as a National Historic Site. However, I'll be the first to admit that my knowledge of Steamtown's early history was very minimal, and I knew nothing about the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern. Author Rick Kfoury explores this topic in his latest book, Steam Trains of Yesteryear, the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern Story. The book briefly covers the early life of Blount before moving into the beginning of his purchasing steam locomotives, his first season of running excursions on the Claremont to Concord Railway, the birth of Steamtown USA in Bellows Falls, Vermont, and the formation of the Green Mountain Railway. For full disclosure, this book was given to me by the author for this review. There's a spirit of pioneerism that this book captures quite well. Tourist railroads were not nearly as common in the 1960s as they are today, so the ones that did had a fly by the seat of your pants and see what works quality. Rail operations like Steamtown did much both to preserve equipment and determine how to use it for interpreting the past. The detailed recollections of former MSNN employees, combined with the author's research, help to debunk myths and give a sense of character and personality to the railroad and its employees. I never found this book dry or losing sight of the bigger story. A key component to this immersion is the many color photographs that fill each chapter. My favorite part of the history was the first season of Operation using ex-Canadian National Tank Engine number 47, and the chapter has a number of photos showing the black and yellow trains skirting the shores of Lake Sunapee. My only qualm with this book is that after Blount's death in 1967, the story feels a bit rushed to connect the dots between that event and the opening of Steamtown National Historic Site in 1995. Granted, the focus of the book is in Steamtown's early years, but I wish the speed transition had not been quite as abrupt. If you are involved in rail preservation, past or present, you have to give this book a read. There are stories of events here that resonate with what I've learned can happen behind the scenes even today. This is also one of the rare railroad history books that I can recommend not just to rail fans, but to members of the general public who enjoy stories about plucky operations, the history of tourism, and the spirit of innovation. I give Steam Trains of Yesteryear, the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern Story, 4.5 out of 5 stars.
And now, the question of the day.
Last time on the Roundhouse, we were talking to Christopher Parker, the executive director of Vermont Rail Action Network, about exploring commuter rail opportunities in the state of Vermont, which led to the question, what commuter rail service has impressed you the most? A few responses from Facebook. First, Matthew Betzner writes, Virginia Railway Express. Those trains impressed me with their sleek appearance. Tony Burzio was impressed by Brightline, and Elizabeth Ozark, my mom, was impressed by British Railways. I'd like to do more with books as part of the podcast. I don't know if it'll be part of regular episodes or a spin-off, but maybe a pseudo-reading club. It's tricky because so many railroad history books are out of print, and that makes it difficult to get your hands on them to actually read them. But I want to explore stories and histories that aren't necessarily easily found online. So to start this off, my question to you for this episode is, what is the best railroad history book that you've read? Something that's so well detailed and written that it will win over people who are new to that concept, that railroad, whatever the case may be. Let me know on the roundhousepodcast.com. Links to social media there. Thank you guys for listening. And remember, as always, the Roundhouse is our house.